Okay. Hi, I'm Max. This is actually the first talk I'll ever have given in front of an audience that wasn't a bunch of physicists, so see how it goes. And the name of my talk today is Working Interactively with Large and Remote Data in JupyterLab. So I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the Jupyter Notebook. So the Jupyter project as a whole began life with just the notebook, and you actually would have to change directory in like a terminal or something to the notebook that you want to run and like run it on it directly in order to actually open anything. But over time, more and more tools were added to the ecosystem. So big thing was the rather nice file browser that actually let you navigate around and open multiple notebooks. And over time, plain text editor has also been added, terminal. And so in making the next generation of Jupyter Notebook interface, JupyterLab, one of the goals of the developers has been to create a more integrated experience. So if you're not familiar with it, this is sort of the view that opens when you run JupyterLab for the first time. So there's a file browser on the left panel, and then just the same kind of notebook as Notebook Classic in the main panel. But you can also do many, many more things with JupyterLab than you could with Notebook Classic. So you can have multiple notebooks open, running in potentially different languages side by side. What's shown here on the sidebar right there is a tool for editing the metadata of the cells of each of the notebooks. And then you can also have like complex visualizations going on at the same time next to that. Many, many different things. And one of the new things that you can do with JupyterLab that you couldn't do with Notebook is open many, many different types of files. So quick demo of that. So for example, you can open image files, you can open source files, JSON gives you like a nice little tree view. You can open markdown files. You can also, for many types of files, open more than one view of them. So for example, for markdown files, you can also open a rendered view. And of course, you can still open notebooks. And one of the really nifty things that JupyterLab can do is, for example, if you start a new console, which is kind of just like a command line interface, you can actually attach it to the same kernel, basically the same instance of Python that the notebook that you just opened itself is running. You can put them like side by side. And so if you define variables in the notebook, say, the command line of the terminal becomes, the console becomes aware of them. So those variables exist here, and you can actually modify them. And they're modified in the notebook as well. So one thing that I've heard a lot of requests for is a way to, for a lot of users used JupyterLab to interact with their data. They want to, dig into it. They want to analyze it. But one thing that's kind of awkward to do right now is, given that you've navigated to some, data resource in the file browser, it's somewhat difficult or awkward to then actually consume that resource in your notebook. You're basically stuck just writing the same Python code, for importing that data source that you would be anywhere. So it'd be nice if there was a way to more closely integrate the file browser with the notebook, and just like the content stack of JupyterLab in general. All right, let me start that again. But there are some problems with making that happen, and the biggest, maybe fundamental difficulty is just the architecture of Jupyter itself, and this is true for both Notebook Classic and for Lab, is that it's split into kind of three parts. So there is the browser, which is the client. That's the thing that you actually like see and interact with. There's the server, which is the thing that's actually grabbing the files off of your file system. And then there's the kernel, which is the Python instance or whatever that's actually running in the notebook itself. And these are three separate things that not only do they not need to be running on the same computer, they can actually be running on different continents. And sort of a more immediate problem is that part of the way that Jupyter has avoided dealing with these difficult problems is to make it so that whenever you request a file in your client, the server will immediately actually eagerly fetch the entire contents of that file back to your client. So there's like a large remote data transfer at that point before your browser will actually like render anything. And so if you're I personally, for my research, I often worked with files that were like terabytes in size. So for something like that, this is completely impractical. Another limitation is that the file browser itself is tied to just whatever local file system the server happens to be running on. And so what we'd like is for it to be more flexible, for essentially anything that is a data store, anything that sort of looks like a file system, no matter whether it's living locally or living remotely, that you'd be able to browse through it using the file browser. And this is not a new problem. So these issues have been brought up since the beginning of the JupyterLab project 3 or 4 years ago. But until now, there haven't really been any practical implementations of solutions for them. And so one solution for one small part of the problem is JupyterLab HDF5, which allows you to open and interact with potentially very large HDF5 files within JupyterLab itself. So if you're not familiar with HDF5 files, they're basically they're kind of like a mini file system in a single file. So they have direct groups, which are just like directories, on your file system. And then they have data sets, which are just these in simplest terms, like these tabular data sets of numbers or whatever. And give you a demo of that. So, sorry, wrong demo. So the first thing that it lets you do that you couldn't do before is actually open the HDF5 file. So this is not like an actual file system. This is the sort of virtual file system inside the HDF5 file. You can navigate within it, and you can open these files. And the really nice thing is that this file that I'm showing right here has 100 million entries, and yet it opened and loaded really quickly. And you can, scroll through and whatever. You can scroll all the way to the end. It's hard to do from that perspective. And you see that it populates itself, but yes.
Is there a restriction number of columns or rows?
What?
Restriction of number of columns or rows, like in a spreadsheet?
No, there's absolutely no restriction whatsoever. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the cool thing is it's basically because it's lazily loading just the data that it actually needs in order to display it to you. It works with literally any file size as long as the back end can touch it. And this is going to sound maybe a little weird, but a new feature that I'm really excited about that I just added last night is you can actually select the data now and copy it out of that and paste it into whatever. So for example, pandas data frame. And so cut and paste is maybe not something inherently to be that proud of, but an implementation of it that actually works remotely with big data in the JupyterLab architecture, I think is actually a big step forward for the project. So let's see. So JupyterLab HDF5 is great, and over time I'll be adding more and more new features to it. But the problem for the larger project is that the ways that I solve these problems, the problems that I described before, for HDF5 are not really generally applicable. So I had to write a whole independent server just for HDF5 files, and then I actually had to rewrite a pretty significant portion of the file browser UI in the front end to make any of this work. So what we'd like instead would be some kind of more unified way of consuming many, many different potential sources of data. Remote data like S3 or just alternative things like ZAR in a unified way. And there are many, if we do this right, there are many, many cool features we could add. For example, you could copy data from a ZAR file and paste it into an HDF5 file, directly, without needing to actually have it on your local file system at any point. And the really cool thing that we'd like to be able to do is, have an interface by which all these things can be more tightly coupled. So essentially getting back to that use case that I talked about earlier of just navigating to some resource in your file system, no matter where it lives, being able to, say right-click on it and having, not necessarily anything particularly fancy happen, but essentially having it write the boilerplate Python for you for importing that resource. That's sort of like our vision for version 1. And I have a little demo of that. So let's see. So I right-click on that data set, and I select snippet, and I get a snippet. And, takes care of all the paths and import statements and everything for me. And you can do, gets me that data set into a variable named data, and then I can do whatever I want with it, So just for example, plot the first 100 rows, third column, first 100 rows, 17th column. All right. always a problem with live coding. Oh, data, yeah, sorry, that is. You're right. Got a little nervous. There you go. So it looks like a unholy hairball, but that's because this is random data. You could apply whatever you wanted. And so along with sort of this more back-end focused work, there's also a bunch of new experimental UI stuff that people are doing. So this is the work of one of my colleagues at JP Morgan, Tim Payne, who is working on a way to have multiple file browsers at once. So most of these file browsers are just tied to his local file system, but if you squint, like right there, one of them is also tied to a remote S3 store. There. And yeah, so it's right now pretty easy, even if you don't have jupyterlab installed, to start from scratch and try it for yourself. Those 3 instructions. Assuming you have Python installed. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to say yes because I've never done it, but yes, you definitely could. Any questions?
So, what's the difference between what's the difference between JupyterLab and Jupyter Notebook, basically? In simple words, because I see.
I mean, Jupyter, like, the simple way to think about it is that JupyterLab is what?
Repeat my question.
Oh, he asked, in simple terms, what is JupyterLab and how is it different from Notebook Classic? So in simplest terms, JupyterLab is a more integrated tool. I hesitated personally to call it an integrated development environment, but some of my colleagues do. You can think of it like an IDE for notebooks, if you like. But essentially, it's to take all these different pieces that we were working on, that were sort of separated in JupyterLab, in Jupyter, and tie them all together in interesting new ways to create interesting and useful new interactions, like some of the stuff that I just showed you. And the other part of it is that the code base of Notebook Classic is an unholy mess and was hard to extend, and I think everyone was collectively agreed that it was time to move on.
Another question. Where is it at now in terms of other HDF5 things? Like, can you inspect the attributes? Can you edit anything?
So the backend can fetch the metadata right now, but there's no UI for it. But there will be in the near future. We should maybe have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
Next on the roadmap, other formats like Parquet, for instance?
I mean, absolutely. Like that would be one of the things we'd want to be able to handle.
Hi, I'd like to elaborate on the previous question about difference between Jupyter Labs and Jupyter Notebooks. Is it only the difference in the UI, or there is also some difference in the way the resources are managed, the performance manifests itself?
No, so one of the main goals of the project for like the first release, which was in July, was to get it to a point where the experience of using the notebook in JupyterLab was at more or less absolute parity with Notebook Classic. So there's no real difference that anybody should be concerned with, at least in terms of the notebook itself.
Okay, actually, I've got a question. So something.
If there is a difference, it's a bug, and you should put it on our tracker.
Okay, so something I kind of noticed about Jupyter Notebook sometimes is that if I open it, in a directory, I can only, navigate downwards from where I opened it, right? And does that still exist in JupyterLab?
Oh no, you can. There's a here. I'll show you. So this doesn't look very good scrunched up, but there's this breadcrumbs thing on the top. So clicking on that will take you back to your home directory, wherever you started from, and then just if you're like only a couple levels deep, you can just go back to like wherever you were before.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, any more questions? If not, let's give it a hand for Max.